In the last video, we wrote out a lot of code to get a component visible on the screen of our device. Now in this video, I want to take a quick pause and review some of the code that we've written out. In particular, I think that you might have a couple of different questions about the code we just wrote. So I want to go over a couple of different common questions right here and provide a couple of different answers for each one. So first off, what's that text thing that we imported inside of our component screen.js file? So I'm talking about this text thing right there. So that text thing is what we refer to as a primitive React element. Primitive React elements are provided by the React Native library. They allow us to show some amount of basic content to a user. So a text element is a primitive React element that shows some very basic text to a user. There are several other primitive elements that you need to be aware of, and we're going to look at these over time. Another primitive element is called a view. A view allows us to show kind of some general grouping element that can assemble different elements together and provide some styling to them. We also have a primitive element called an image that we can use to show an image to a user, or a button that shows a button. There are several other primitive elements you need to be aware of, and as I mentioned, we'll go over these over time. Okay, next up, what's that HTML looking stuff? We refer to it as JSX. So I'm talking specifically as this text tag right there. So this is what we refer to as JSX. This is not technically valid JavaScript. When you write out this code right here, it then passes into that React Native bundler that's running inside of our terminal. That bundler is using a tool called Babel to turn this JSX into some plain JavaScript code. So let me show you exactly what that line right there turns into when we convert it into normal JavaScript. So I'm going to copy that JSX element right there, the entire text element. I'm then going to go over to a website called babeljs.io. So this is a tool that is being used by the React Native bundler to turn our code into plain JavaScript, as opposed to the JSX we fed into it. On this page in particular, on the left-hand side, I can enter in some JSX, and it will show me the resulting JavaScript on the right-hand side. So I'm going to paste in that text element, and we'll see the result over here. So as you can see, a JSX element gets turned into a normal function call. Nothing weird about this whatsoever. It's just a normal function call to a function called react.createElement. So why do we use JSX? Well, as you're going to see very soon, when we put together React components, we frequently write out many different JSX elements like this one right here. If we were to write out all those different JSX elements instead as normal function calls like this, it would result in a component that's really hard to make changes to and really hard to modify and maintain over time. So instead, we make use of this JSX syntax just to make our lives as developers a little bit easier. That's pretty much it. We'll talk more about the rules around JSX very soon. Okay, so next big question you might have. What's that app navigator, or the navigator thing in general, inside the app.js file? Okay, so back inside of app.js right here, remember we've got this create stack navigator function. So this navigator stuff that you see inside the app.js file, as I mentioned, I wrote this out ahead of time just to save us a little bit of complexity. All that navigator stuff is from a tool called React Navigation. This is a library that's used in a ton of different React Native projects for handling navigation. When we talk about navigation, we're really discussing about showing different content to the user, so making it appear as though there are different screens of content inside of our application. We're going to learn about React navigation over time, and eventually we're going to wire all this stuff up from scratch on a future application. All right, final question. What's that styles thing back inside of our component file? All right, so back inside of component screen.js, I'm talking about this styles object right here. So just to be clear, because you might have seen a different way of applying styling to an element on some other React Native content, maybe another tutorial or a blog post, we are not strictly required to apply styling to an element using this stylesheet.create function call right here. The only reason we use stylesheet.create is that it will automatically validate the different styling rules that we're trying to apply to an element. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to pull my application back on the screen really quickly, and I want you to notice that I've got a font size property right here. So as you might guess, we're trying to use this rule to change the font size of our text element. In order to change the font size, we have to pass in a property that is specifically font size with a capital S. So if we change the spelling of this, or even the capitalization, the rule will not be applied correctly. So for example, if I change font size to have a lowercase s instead, and then save this, I'll very quickly see an error message appear. So it says font size is not a valid style property. This validation and the big red error message that you're seeing right here is provided by this stylesheet.create function. Now, just to show you a little technicality very quickly, I'm going to comment out that styles object. And then up here on my text element, rather than referencing styles.textstyle, I'm going to delete that and replace it with a plain JavaScript object. So notice that I now have two sets of curly braces. And then inside of here, I'll say font size of 30 like so. So if we want to, we can technically pass a styling object directly into a JSX element, and everything's going to work just fine. In addition, if we make a typo inside there, and I instead put in like font size with a lowercase s, we're still going to see not an error, not a big red error message, but we will see a warning down here at the bottom that has essentially the same message, something telling us, hey, we did something incorrectly. So this stylesheet.create function right here, we're only using because it shows a big red error message to us that tells us immediately, right away, that we did something poorly with styling inside of some given component. So it's an immediate signal to you and I that we need to go and figure out what we did incorrectly. Now, the only reason I show you this alternate way of applying styling is just to let you know that if we don't want to always have to create this big style sheet object down here, we always have a kind of escape hatch. And we'll talk about why we might want to pass what we refer to as an inline style right here over time. For now, I'm going to undo these changes I made. So I'm going to uncomment that, and I'll change this back to styles.textstyle. And I'm back to, oops, let me change the font size here as well. There we go, that's better. Okay, so that's the stylesheet.create function. Again, we use it because it's going to validate the different rules that we're trying to apply to some given element. All right, now that we've gone over a couple of different questions that you might have right here, let's continue working on our first little application in the next video.